Hello, welcome to a special July 4th, Independence Day edition of Catholic Lives. If you're listening to this, by the way, somewhere outside of the United States, July 4th is the Independence Day of the United States. So, this special episode has to do with the one and only Catholic signer of the American Declaration of Independence from the British colonies in 1776. And this was Charles Carroll of Carrollton, our Catholic life for this week. Who was Charles Carroll? Well, he was born in Annapolis in the colony of Maryland in 1737. Son of the wealthiest family in colonial Maryland, very prominent family. His grandfather Charles had actually emigrated to the colonies from Ireland in the 17th century in order to escape religious discrimination in the British Isles. And he did this in 1689, because in 1688 there was a revolution in England. And this revolution, if you don't know, got rid of the Catholic James II, excluded Catholics from the throne, and sort of enshrined into English law disabilities and discrimination against Catholics. And this had, by the way, even had the same effect in Maryland, because if you don't know, the colony of Maryland was actually founded in 1632 by a Catholic nobleman named Lord Baltimore as a haven for Catholics in England at the time. And they had religious toleration there. Catholics had been more or less, prominent members of the government and society in early colonial Maryland. But with the revolution of 1688, Protestant landholders took over the colony of Maryland. And they overturned religious toleration. They rejected freedom of worship for Catholics, and also instantiated some other legal disabilities we'll discuss in a second for Catholics in Maryland. And so when Charles was 10 years old, he had to be educated in secret at a Jesuit school on the eastern shore of Maryland, near the coast, along, by the way, with his cousin, John Carroll, who was the future first bishop of the United States after the American Revolution. Later on, he was sent to St. Omer's in Flanders, in French-held Flanders, Belgium today, to continue his studies in Europe, and then went on a grand tour, also taking coursework in Paris, Bourges, and then studying law in London in his time. He spent 16 years, actually, on the continent. Even though, by the way, he could not practice law as a Catholic in Maryland. It's one of the things you couldn't do. You couldn't practice law, couldn't hold public office. And so he comes back to Maryland in 1765, polished, articulate, very well educated. And in fact, he's sort of given his entree into his family's fortunes by his father, who gives him a 10,000-acre tract of land in Frederick County, Maryland, which he comes to call Carrollton. And the reason being that even though he never lived there, he called, when he'd write letters and things of that nature, he would add the word Carrollton to his signature to distinguish himself from all the other Carrolls, actually a bunch of Charles Carrolls in his family. That's why we call him Charles Carroll of Carrollton. 3 years later, he married Mary Darnall, his cousin, in 1768, with whom he had 7 children. And in fact, his home, the Carroll House, as it's called today, in Annapolis, Maryland, would become the site for the official state celebration, both of the peace and the formal recognition of United States independence following the American Revolution. So it became a major place later on. However, he didn't enter public life until 1773. If you recall, going back, there's lots of turmoil after the 7 Years' War, in which the British kicked the French out of North America, because the British want to tax the colonies to pay for the war, basically. And so from 1765 onward, there's big debates about the colonies and the rights of the colonists, and can Parliament tax them? This is the Stamp Act. This is no taxation without representation. But he doesn't become involved until 1773. This is after the Boston Tea Party, after the Boston Massacre in 1773, when Carroll involves himself in a pamphlet debate with another supporter of the sort of state establishment in Maryland, the colonial establishment, British establishment, over the established church. The established church, by that I mean the Church of England, which was the legally established church in the colonies. You had established churches. In fact, you even had established churches, state established churches. By state established, we mean either protected by law, supported by state taxation, or something of that nature. In most of the colonies, save for one or two, and even many of the states, even after the Revolution, still had them for several decades, until they eventually disappeared and were done away with that law. But this is what he got in this pamphlet debate with this other person, in which he emerged as a popular figure for arguing in favor of freedom of conscience, religious toleration, but also for the rights of the elected assembly. He identifies the people as the fount of, ultimately, law in colonial Maryland. And for this defense of colonial rights, he becomes basically a public figure for the first time. Once he's identified, they see through these pseudonyms they use in these debates, and on that basis was sent with a delegation of men to negotiate with essentially with Canada, try to get the Canadians on the North American colony side in this dispute with Britain. It didn't work, but all of this brought him to wider public notice. He became a public figure across the colonies by 1774. And that year, he was also elected to the Second Maryland Convention. And by convention, you had colonies at that point trying to throw off the royal charters and form their own government. And this is what this was. Which his election to that convention effectively ended the ban on Catholics in political office in Maryland. 2 years later, he's elected to the Maryland legislature in 1776, and then sent as a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. If you know what the Continental Congress was, there was the first one which meant to respond to all of these actions of the British, closing down the port of Boston, quartering troops there, stuff like this. He sent to the second one, where on July 2nd, 1776, he becomes one of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was later on appointed to another convention to write the new Maryland Constitution, and elected to the first Maryland Senate in 1776, where he would serve continuously until 1800. The next year, 1777, he was appointed delegate to Congress again, and in 1783, he was elected president of the Maryland Senate. After the war itself, in 1789, he became one of Maryland's first senators in the United States Senate, although he resigned in 1792 when the Constitution was amended to forbid the simultaneous holding of state and national offices. And so he remained in the Maryland legislature until 1800, when he retired from public life. And in his retirement, he stayed very busy, more or less, with business, with his private affairs of building up the family fortunes. He remained a lifelong Federalist. If you don't know what federalism is, he was that early party that emerged out of the founding of the Republic in the 1790s, who, like Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, favored a strong central government, favored things like a national bank, in opposition to people like Thomas Jefferson, who was a Republican, not in the modern sense, well, in some ways in the modern sense, but who favored a more decentralized state, among other things, and were suspicious of, the national bank. And in fact, he became a founder of several different major companies. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Company, which have canals, up and down those areas of the country. He invested in the Bank of Maryland, the Bank of Baltimore, as well as the first and second banks of the United States. So he was involved in creating those national institutions of public life, like a Federalist would. And finally, he also helped found the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad system in 1830, toward the end of his life. At age 91, by the way, he was active well into his 90s. One thing I do have to address about Charles Carroll in this day and age, his family was a family of slaveholders. They owned, I think, by the time the Revolution was over, somewhere between 400 and 500 slaves. I think at one point they may have been, as a whole, the largest slave-owning family in the entire colonies. Now, Charles Carroll did, like a lot of the founders, admit the iniquity of slavery, but it was so crucial to their family fortunes, most of them just sort of ignored it or never undertook to free their own slaves. The one act, by the way, he did make toward trying to solve this problem of slavery was to help found the so-called American Colonization Society in 1828. If you don't know what this was a society which both Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, other founders, were involved in, to basically take freed slaves from the United States and repatriate them back to land in the continent of Africa. This is where, in fact, the nation of Liberia comes from to this day, which was founded by resettled Africans, both from the United States, but also from British Canada as well. There were actually African Americans from that period as well, but mostly freed slaves from the United States. And so he was part of this as well. And so finally, what about his faith? I've mentioned it in political terms. Well, John Adams, second president of the United States, founding father, once called him, quote, a Roman Catholic but an ardent patriot, unquote. And this is something, by the way, he wrote this in the heat of the 1770s. This would have been, in the beginning of that conflict with the British and the colonies, this would have seemed perhaps like a contradiction. One, of course, the things that Carroll's known for is his contributions to the Revolution, of course, contributed toward the establishment of freedom of religion and the Constitution in general, but also demonstrated Catholics could be loyal to the Republic. This is a big deal, if you don't know. In the early modern period in England, there was fear that Catholics would be more loyal to the Pope than to the nation itself. And so he's important for those reasons. Although, very interestingly, as I kind of hinted earlier, for the most part, the Carrolls as a family, as a whole, were a very private group. And this is mostly because, prior to the Revolution, because of the legal and social restrictions in colonial Maryland, they would focus most of their activities on building up the wealth of the family estates and the family fortune. And I think I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth mentioning again. By the time of the Revolution, the Carrolls as a whole were reputed to be the wealthiest family in the colonies. As for Charles Carroll himself, by all accounts, he was a very devout man, though for the most part, the nature of his faith, specifics of what he believed, his devotional practice, haven't been that much studied by historians. Although, in 1822, the first officially legally sanctioned Catholic church in Annapolis was built on his property, on the Carroll House property in Annapolis, Maryland. The parish still exists today, although the building doesn't, but the house is still there. You can go visit it if you ever go to Maryland. And so this founder of the new republic, this revolutionary, this Catholic landowner, finally met the end of his life at age 95 in 1832. He was the last of the signers of the Declaration of Independence to pass away. And he was supposed to have said just before his death that, quote, I have lived to my 96th year. I have enjoyed continued health. I have been blessed with great wealth, prosperity, and most of the good things which the world can bestow. Public approbation, esteem, applause. But what I now look back on with the greatest satisfaction to myself is that I have practiced the duties of my religion, unquote. And so, at least according to Charles Carroll, he fulfilled his duties as a Catholic and also was successful in his worldly ventures. And by the way, if you heard noise in the background earlier, those are fireworks going off. So this is being recorded on July the 4th. So that is our Catholic Life for this week. I hope you enjoyed learning about Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Again, if you like what you heard, please go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe, leave comments, or anywhere else. Please spread the word about the podcast. Have a wonderful rest of the Independence Day for my United States listeners, and a great week for everyone else who's listening. Take care, and may the peace of Christ be with you.